In the architecture of legal systems, the distinction between common law and civil law traditions is foundational. Among the defining features of common law jurisdictions is the primacy of case law, also known as judicial precedent, which serves as a structural pillar shaping the development, interpretation, and application of law across generations. Case law consists of legal rules and principles emerging from judicial decisions that carry normative weight beyond the immediate parties involved. In countries such as the United Kingdom, United States, Canada, and Australia, case law operates as a co-equal source of law alongside statutes. Its historical roots trace to medieval England, where royal courts standardized legal practices and developed the doctrine of stare decisis, meaning to stand by things decided. Stare decisis promotes legal certainty, fairness, and institutional legitimacy by ensuring courts follow established precedents. Decisions of higher courts bind lower courts, fostering predictability and stability. However, only the ratio decidendi, the essential legal reasoning, of a decision is binding, whereas obiter dicta are persuasive but not obligatory. Case law enables the organic evolution of legal doctrine, allowing courts to interpret statutes, fill legislative gaps, and adapt principles to new contexts. Landmarks like Donahue v. Stevenson and Brown v. Board of Education illustrate its transformative power. Case law also plays a pivotal role in constitutional interpretation, exemplified by Marbury v. Madison, which established judicial review in the U.S. courts interpret statutes, resolve conflicts, and apply norms to specific scenarios, as seen in A.V. Secretary of State for the Home Department. Judicial creativity, demonstrated in cases such as Central London Property Trust Ltd v. High Trees House Ltd, allows judges to innovate and address gaps in formal rules. Critics highlight complexity, entrenchment of outdated norms, and judicial activism, prompting reforms like the restatements of the law. In civil law systems, case law is influential but not binding, with globalization fostering convergence. Ultimately, case law in common law systems reflects a philosophy valuing judicial reasoning and incremental development, making it an essential source of law shaping both present and future legal landscapes. The doctrine of stare decisis, meaning to stand by things decided, is a foundational principle in common law jurisprudence. It requires courts to adhere to established precedents when deciding cases with materially similar facts, ensuring consistency, predictability, and stability in the legal system. Lower courts must follow decisions of higher courts within the same jurisdiction. For example, the UK Supreme Court's rulings bind all subordinate courts. London Tramways Co. v. London County Council affirmed this principle by holding that the House of Lords was bound by its own previous decisions. Stare decisis enhances efficiency and fairness, as similar cases are treated similarly. However, it is not inflexible. Higher courts can overrule their precedents, as demonstrated by the UK's 1966 practice statement and the US Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education, which overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. Stare decisis also has a horizontal aspect, with courts at the same level treating each other's decisions as persuasive rather than binding. Proper application depends on correctly identifying the ratio decidendi, the binding legal principle, rather than obiter dicta. The doctrine supports statutory interpretation, reinforcing continuity and preventing arbitrary shifts. Critics argue it may entrench outdated principles or inhibit innovation, but mechanisms like overruling precedents and academic commentary maintain flexibility. In civil law systems, stare decisis is largely absent, but persuasive use of prior decisions is growing. Stare decisis remains a cornerstone of common law, balancing tradition with transformation in the pursuit of justice. Understanding the doctrine of precedent requires examining the hierarchical structure of the judiciary in common law systems. The authority of judicial decisions is contingent on the court's position within this hierarchy, determining whether a precedent is binding or persuasive. Supreme or final courts, such as the UK Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, and Australia's High Court, issue decisions binding on all lower courts in their jurisdiction. This vertical binding ensures uniform application of legal principles, reinforcing legal certainty and preventing fragmentation. Lower courts must follow higher courts' decisions, regardless of their own views. Horizontally, decisions by courts of equal rank are persuasive but not binding, allowing for flexibility and nuanced legal development. In the U.S., the federal court system's 3 tiers, district courts, circuit courts, and the Supreme Court illustrate how binding authority flows downward. Circuit court decisions bind district courts within the same circuit, but not others, creating potential for circuit splits and prompting Supreme Court intervention. State court hierarchies mirror this structure, with Supreme Courts binding all lower state courts. Specialized courts also observe hierarchical binding, such as the Employment Appeal Tribunal in the UK and specialized tribunals in the US higher courts, can overrule their own precedents, enabling legal evolution, as seen in the UK's 1966 practice statement and the US Supreme Court's reversal of Plessy v. Ferguson by Brown v. Board of Education. Persuasive authority from courts in other jurisdictions fosters transnational common law jurisprudence. The hierarchical model promotes consistency, predictability, and integrity, while allowing flexibility and recognizing persuasive authority. Grasping the interplay between judicial hierarchy and precedent is essential to understanding the logic and operation of common law systems. Distinguishing between ratio decidendi and obiter dicta is a critical skill in common law analysis. The ratio decidendi, or reason for deciding, is the binding legal principle emerging from a case and must be followed by lower courts under stare decisis. Obiter dicta, things said by the way, are incidental observations or comments that, while persuasive, do not carry binding authority. Proper identification of the ratio is essential for applying precedent and evolving legal principles. This involves parsing judgments to isolate the legal rule applied to material facts. In Donahue v. Stevenson, the ratio was that a manufacturer owes a duty of care to the ultimate consumer, a principle that became binding precedent. Lord Atkin's broader moral commentary, The Neighbor Principle, was obiter dicta, influential but not binding. Extracting the ratio can be complex, especially in multi-judge courts, where consensus must be identified from majority reasoning. Statements can evolve from obiter to ratio as they are adopted in subsequent decisions. Lawyers and judges must accurately identify the ratio to argue or decide cases effectively. In legal education, this distinction teaches critical case reading and understanding of legal argumentation. While civil law systems rely on codified statutes, concepts of ratio and obiter provide a framework for understanding judicial influence across traditions. Mastery of this distinction is foundational for engaging with the logic, structure, and evolution of common law jurisprudence. Case law is not merely a repository of judicial decisions. It is a dynamic mechanism through which the law evolves in common law systems. Courts interpret and adapt legal principles when resolving disputes, allowing the law to respond incrementally to societal, technological, and moral changes. This process keeps the law relevant without constant legislative intervention. Landmark decisions like Brown v. Board of Education demonstrate the judiciary's role in reshaping legal doctrine and catalyzing social change, overturning previous precedents and setting new constitutional principles. Legal evolution occurs in private law as well, with cases like Donahue v. Stevenson expanding negligence doctrine and shaping liability standards. Contract law doctrines such as promissory estoppel and frustration emerged from judicial decisions, adapting rules to commercial realities and ethical considerations. Judicial interpretation addresses gaps in legislation, particularly in rapidly changing areas like digital technology, data privacy, and cybercrime. Case law evolves incrementally, balancing continuity and flexibility, guided by stare decisis. Judges use analogical reasoning to adapt principles to novel situations, fostering legal dialogue and refinement. Each decision adds to a cumulative body of precedent, analyzed by legal practitioners and scholars. While more pronounced in common law systems, judicial influence is growing in civil law countries as well. Case law thus serves as a living mechanism of legal evolution, ensuring the law remains responsive, principled, and resilient in a dynamic world. In common law systems, case law and statute interact dynamically, rather than in opposition. Statutes represent formal legal norms enacted by legislatures, but their application often depends on judicial interpretation. Courts resolve ambiguities, fill gaps, and adapt statutory language to changing contexts, making case law essential for practical implementation. Judges apply principles of statutory construction, considering plain meaning, legislative intent, and broader context, sometimes referencing extrinsic materials and prior case law. A key example is the UK's Human Rights Act 1998, where courts interpret rights in light of European Convention jurisprudence, as seen in AV Secretary of State for the Home Department. Statutes may codify, modify, or introduce new rules, with courts determining their relationship to prior case law. The Consumer Rights Act 2015, for instance, draws on earlier decisions to clarify new provisions. Case law fills legislative gaps, especially in contract and tort law, supplementing statutes with common law principles. Statutes can also override case law through legislative reform, as with the UK's Compensation Act 2006. In constitutional contexts, statutes must conform to constitutional norms, with courts reviewing validity and influencing statutory interpretation. This interplay ensures statutes are living instruments, shaped by judicial reasoning to remain effective and responsive. The relationship varies across legal traditions, but judicial interpretation is universally important. Ultimately, case law and statute collaborate to enhance responsiveness, coherence, and legitimacy in the legal system. Case law plays a central role in constitutional interpretation in common law countries with written constitutions. Courts engage in constitutional construction, defining government structure, individual rights, and limits of state power. Judicial review empowers courts to invalidate legislation contravening constitutional provisions, making case law a cornerstone of constitutional governance. Marbury v. Madison established judicial review in the U.S., affirming the judiciary's duty to interpret law and the supremacy of the Constitution. Courts develop a body of precedent clarifying constitutional meanings, guiding lawmakers and citizens. In India, the Supreme Court's basic structure doctrine, developed in Kesavananda Bharati v. State of Kerala, protects fundamental constitutional features from amendment, reinforcing judicial preservation of constitutional integrity. Constitutional case law evolves with societal changes, as seen in the U.S. Supreme Court's decisions on segregation, abortion, and same-sex marriage, such as Brown v. Board of Education and Obergefell v. Hodges. Courts employ various interpretive methodologies: textualism, purposivism, living constitution, shaping case law and reflecting broader interpretive debates. Case law mediates competing constitutional principles, balancing rights and interests through doctrinal frameworks like strict scrutiny. Courts also define constitutional remedies and expand access, as in India's public interest litigation. Comparative analysis enriches constitutional jurisprudence, with courts citing foreign decisions and engaging in transnational dialogue. Critics raise concerns about judicial bias and legitimacy, but safeguards maintain institutional integrity. Case law is indispensable for translating constitutional texts into enforceable norms and shaping constitutional governance. Judges in common law systems are active participants in legal development, exercising judicial creativity grounded in precedent, analogical reasoning, and institutional responsibility. Judicial creativity shapes legal principles, refines doctrines, and introduces new concepts, ensuring the law remains coherent and responsive. Reasoning by analogy allows judges to incrementally adapt the law, applying established principles to similar cases and distinguishing new ones. A notable example is Central London Property Trust Ltd v High Trees House Ltd, where Lord Dinning introduced promissory estoppel, enabling enforcement of promises relied upon without consideration. This doctrine, rooted in fairness, has become a key aspect of English contract law. In tort law, judicial creativity expanded negligence doctrine from Donahue v. Stevenson, covering diverse contexts like malpractice and economic loss. Constitutional law sees courts interpreting abstract provisions and balancing competing interests, shaping public policy and influencing legislative reform. Judicial creativity operates within precedent, institutional constraints, and reasoned judgments, ensuring innovation is principled. Judges respond to litigants' arguments, case facts, and legal gaps, solving problems within legal norms. The extent of creativity varies across jurisdictions, with some courts emphasizing restraint and others embracing expansive roles. Critics argue it may undermine democratic legitimacy, but proponents highlight adaptability and protection of rights. Comparative law shows judicial creativity influencing both common law and civil law systems. Judicial creativity is essential for understanding common law's flexibility, dynamism, and capacity for principled legal evolution. Case law, while foundational in common law systems, faces significant limitations and criticisms. Its complexity arises from the vast number of decisions across jurisdictions, creating a dense body of law that challenges clarity and accessibility. Stare decisis can entrench outdated or unjust decisions, as seen in the persistence of Plessy v. Ferguson, until it was overturned by Brown v. Board of Education. The specificity of judicial decisions and judges' interpretive philosophies can lead to unpredictability and undermine legal certainty and fairness. Judicial overreach is another concern, particularly in appellate courts, where judges may effectively create new law, raising issues of democratic legitimacy. The opacity of judicial reasoning, with varying clarity and structure in opinions, complicates the extraction of binding principles and the distinction between ratio decidendi and obiter dicta. Accessibility is further hindered by technical language and fragmented decisions, making case law difficult for non-lawyers and even professionals to navigate. Reform efforts such as the restatements of the law in the U.S. aim to synthesize and clarify case law, providing accessible formulations. Codification offers clarity and consistency, but may reduce flexibility and fail to capture the nuances of case-by-case adjudication. These limitations affect legal education and professional training, demanding rigorous analytical skills. Comparatively, civil law systems offer clarity but may lack adaptability. The convergence of legal traditions has led to increased borrowing and hybridization. Understanding these criticisms is essential for engaging critically with the legal system and contributing to its development. The comparative study of legal systems highlights significant variations in the role of case law between common law, mixed, and civil law traditions. In common law countries like the UK, US, Canada, and Australia, case law is a primary and binding source under stare decisis, shaping legal reasoning and incremental development. Civil law systems such as France and Germany prioritize codified statutes, with judicial decisions serving as interpretations rather than binding authorities. The principle of jurisprudence constant in civil law systems provides persuasive value, but lacks the binding force of common law precedent. Mixed systems like those in South Africa, Scotland, and Louisiana blend elements of both traditions, resulting in hybrid approaches to case law. South Africa's Roman Dutch law foundation is complemented by English common law influences, particularly in constitutional matters. Scotland's legal system recognizes precedent and blends Roman law and codified doctrines, creating a nuanced approach. Civil law countries increasingly rely on prior decisions for consistency and interpretation, with higher court rulings carrying significant persuasive weight. The rise of constitutional courts has elevated case law's role, with binding decisions on constitutional matters. Globalization accelerates convergence, with EU law, international arbitration, and human rights adjudication integrating case law into civil law systems. EU case law binds national courts, fostering common law-style reasoning in areas governed by EU law. International arbitration and human rights law create transnational bodies of persuasive authority. Legal education and scholarship now engage with case law analysis across traditions. Despite remaining differences, the influence of case law is expanding, reflecting interconnected legal systems. Understanding these shifts is crucial for appreciating the complexity, diversity, and convergence of modern legal systems.